always had this sense that women are each other's allies in fairy tales, that fairy godmothers and sisters, and in particular, are allies of other women. And so these are stories about women working together
Mm.
to protect each other and entertain each other and to get each other out of difficult spots.
Mm.
You may be familiar with classic, well-known fairy tales such as Cinderella, Red Riding Hood and Sleeping Beauty. However, stories like The Goose Girl, Personette or The Good Woman and so many more may be less commonly recognised. The collection of fairy tales prominent in our culture is largely influenced by media such as Disney, yet there exists a wealth of remarkable tales beyond this mainstream selection. In this podcast, we will examine some of these lesser-known narratives, including folk tales, fairy tales and myths, and highlight individuals who are dedicated to preserving and interpreting their unique qualities and enchantment. This is the Lost and Forgotten Fairy Tales podcast. My name is Alyssa Curtain, and I would love for you to join me on this grand adventure into what is one of the most magical areas of literature, fairy tales.
Welcome to our second ever Lost and Forgotten Fairy Tales podcast, where we are speaking with Nikki Sulway, who's in New South Wales in Australia. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Alyssa. It's a pleasure to be here.
Well, one of the goals of this podcast is to explore the people who are working with fairy tales, like the new saloniers, if you like, the people who are working to continue the fairy tales in modern culture. Where are your origins with fairy tales? What's your earliest memory of a fairy tale? And which one was it?
Oh, my earliest memory. I'll probably tell a different story every time you ask me because my memory goes back a long time. But I think my earliest memory that I strongly remember is that my Oma, so my Dutch grandmother, gave me a Dutch language edition of The Little Mermaid when I was very small, like very, not able to read, and read it to me in Dutch, which I didn't have very much Dutch at that point, so I don't know that I understood it very well, but I loved that book and I loved my Oma to distraction, and I still have the book somewhere here, and the illustrations wedged themselves in my heart as much as the story and that relationship. And I think, one of the consequences that is really just that, like a lot of people for a long time, I associated fairy tales with childhood, with these very early reading experiences, and with this connection with an older woman in my family telling the story to me, reading the story to me. And and also because Anderson stories, and this edition of Little Mermaid was true to that. Anderson stories are tragic and dark, and they're full of mourning and longing and despair and violence, and but also extraordinary beauty, and the connection between the sisters is something I always remember, even though it's not a strong part of the retellings you often see in the mainstream, that the kind of this just that come and rescue her really towards the end. And I remember the Little Mermaid dressed in a little hunter's uniform and sleeping on the pillow outside the prince's bedroom and thinking, I want to sleep like a little puppy. Yeah. So that's a long answer, but I think that's one of my earliest memories, being in Holland in my grandmother's, home in Haarlem with her smoking like a chimney and telling this story, which I just loved so much.
Isn't that wonderful that the interplay between relationships with loved ones, which comes in early childhood reading and things like that, but also the fairy tales and the memory and I imagine you've got the smells of the smoking, it's so sensory for you. Do you happen to remember who
Yes,
the
very
illustrator was?
much. Oh, I wish I could remember, and I can't see the book from where I'm sitting, so I'm not going to go up and go and find it. But
Yeah.
they're they're watercolor, they're full color watercolor, and I remember things like the Mermaid's Garden was really vividly illustrated and full of seaweed and
Yeah.
starfish and all these corals, and I thought that was really quite beautiful. Um, yeah, I'll find it for you though and send it to you in case
No, that sounds
you can
great.
add it in at some
It's
point.
interesting that there's corals and things, and yet Anderson was in Denmark, so it's a cold place. There's no coral there.
Mm,
So interesting that the
mm.
story has the more tropical illustrations to it.
Yeah, yeah. I guess because it's her garden. So
Mm.
in Anderson's story, that she cultivates this garden, and that it is partly a cultivation of the natural. When we were in Copenhagen a couple of years ago, everyone goes to see the Little Mermaid that's in the harbour. The very famous statue of the Little Mermaid. But one of my favorite sculptures of a mermaid. It's not the Little Mermaid, but this other Agnes, another version of a mermaid story. And there's a beautiful sculpture just as you're walking down to where one of Anderson's houses. You have to go over this bridge and stand on the bridge and look into the water. And under the water are the mermaid's children that she's left behind in the ocean with their father because she's left them, gone back to the surface, gone back to her human body and her human life. And the abandoned children and the mer husband are there under the water. And you can only see them when the water's clear, when
Oh,
it's clear and
wow.
they're quite beautiful. Yeah, it's really um astonishing sculpture and such a beautiful thing to see if you're ever in Copenhagen.
Yes,
You can
I'm
find
sure. I
it.
mean, I'm sure there's many people listening and watching who've wanted to go or intend to go. So, did
Mm,
you stay
mm,
with Anderson? Was Anderson like your go-to fairy tale collection, or were there others
mm.
that sort of popped up?
Um, I think yeah, it's hard to know. I think I was lucky to have a lot of books as a child, really, and lots of both traditional fairy tales, Grimm. I'm sure we had some Grimm collections in the end, and several collections of Anderson, and different versions of his collection. And we had some of those great fairy tale collections that were illustrated by the Johnston sisters, those ones that have the white cat in them, and so very mixed bag kind of collections that we had as
Mm,
children.
yeah.
And oh yeah, so lots of things and lots of things that were kind of fairy tale adjacent. I loved the Digit Dip books, which are very Australian, about a little boy so small they slept in a matchbox, and um Pookie, rabbits, lots of sort of fantastic fairy tale. So but I Anderson's stories did continue to resonate with me. I remember going to see the ballet, The Red Shoes, when I was, I don't know, a bit older, and I knew the story because I'd read it, but the ballet was devastating and gorgeous and
Mm.
strange, and I love those stories. But yeah, again, Anderson's stories are much more sort of melancholy than
Mm.
grim, much more melancholy and mm, yeah,
Mm.
I love them
So,
very much.
yeah. So, what do you think are the lessons that you've learned from fairy tales, both in childhood and then moving through into adulthood? What
Mm.
do they have taught you?
Oh, what have they taught me? So many things. Keep it short. It's a lesson I haven't yet learned. Keep it short. What are the lessons I've learned? I mean, some of the things that are so important to me about fairy tales are not really in the stories themselves, but are related to how they've been shared and
Mm.
distributed. So I'm very interested in and attached to the kind of history of fairy tales. One of the things I always say, I have a friend who's like, why fairy tales? And I'm like, well, one of the things is fairy tales are one of the only long-standing bodies of storytelling or literature in Western culture, at least, that are really strongly about women and girls and really strongly told and shared and created by women and girls for women and girls. And so I think that's really interesting, even though it gets polluted and the Grimms and Anderson and Perot for a long time have been the sort of more visible fairy tale collectors and tellers. There is this strong female tradition, and so there is this sense in the stories that they're stories about women's lives and girls' lives, and the challenges that women have faced and the strength that they've demonstrated in overcoming them, and their versatility and agency. There was this kind of moment in the 70s and 80s when feminist scholars really were like, oh, fairy tales, they're full of passive women, who don't have any agency. And I think it's great that since then there's been a lot of pushback against that and a lot of recovery of these stories about fairy tale heroines that are full of vigor and energy and have agency and willfulness and go on great adventures and all those sorts of things. And I think that's one of the things I really like about them. I don't know if it's the lessons I've learned, maybe just that you can be the focus of your own story. Your story can be about the things that you want and go looking for. I think that also, even though, it's not really true. I've always had this sense that women are actually allies in fairy tales, that fairy godmothers and sisters and in particular are allies of other women. And so these are stories about women working together to protect each other and entertain each other and to get each other out of difficult spots.
I think they certainly do. They definitely challenge the hero's journey, I think, because the hero's journey is a very linear sort of pathway, but in fairy tales, it's women working together, or some of them is obviously the archetype, but it doesn't have to be a beginning, middle, end. Sometimes they take you on this random rambling journey into something. But I think one of the other things is because they were so subversive, particularly the literary tales. And I can't remember if it was Don Wire that said, "Oh, they're just fairy tales. They're nothing. Like we're just telling fairy tales. It's just women's things. Like the innocence of that, and yet they're laced with political drama and gossip and intrigue and all these wonderful things." Yeah. So I really like that answer of the feminine within the fairy tales. That's been something that's resonated for you in your life. Yeah. Do you have
very strong
a fairy tale or a tale that has been overlooked? Do you think that people need to know more about this one? Because we all know the Perot collection, but yeah,
those standard ones. There are so many. I think even though people think they know the Grimms, I mean, the first thing I say is that even though people think they know the Grimms, they know a very small selection of them that come from the Kleine Ausgabe, from the little books, and that were particularly in the Western sort of Europe, America and the UK, the ones that were translated into English and made into those small illustrated books. But in the whole collection, their larger collection, there are some weird and wonderful stories that I think people overlook a lot and forget and that don't get told very much. I like Katie Crackernuts. It's one of my favorites. It's not from the Grimms, but there's a version of Katie Crackernuts in the Grimms. I'm a little bit obsessed at the moment about the Sugar Bride stories, about these brides who there's all kinds. It's kind of a motif, really, rather than a story. But this motif of the bride who, on her wedding night, makes a sugar doll version of herself to put in the bridal bed instead of herself, and to fool her husband in some way, which I think is great. And it's a wonderful image. There's a wonderful version of it in Calvino's collection of Italian folk tales called The King in the Basket, where the king goes. The sisters, 3 sisters, and their father goes away on business, and he gives them each a pot of basil, and he says, you have to look after this pot of basil. I'll know if you've been bad, if you come home and your basil's not in good shape, which, you told me earlier you've been gardening today, and I was thinking, oh yes, we'll know if you've been a bad girl, so your basil will fail. Um, and he goes away and he locks the girls in the house, and the king comes calling, but he pretends he's not the king, and he convinces them to pull him up to their bedroom in a basket. And so he goes up in the basket. Various things happen. I can't tell you the whole story. It's a really long story. It's a really long story. But in the end, two of the sisters get pregnant while they're locked up in the house with the king visiting by the basket, and the other sister doesn't, because she's much stronger and she doesn't fall for his charms and won't. And she, of course, is the one that he wants and the one that he wants to marry. And so on her wedding night, she makes a sugar doll, a sugar bride for him to marry instead, and puts it in the bed. And yeah, it's great. It's wonderful. He, of course, beheads the sugar bride while she's hiding under the bed, which is always a good thing to do on your wedding night.
Oh, I love that.
They're great stories. I love stories that are weird, and yeah, they're kind of wonderfully weird, those stories. And I also like, we were talking about Anderson. I like Anderson's The Shadow, which, does get included in collections of his fairy tales, but it's quite a strange story about a man whose shadow takes on a life of its own, and he becomes the shadow of his shadow. They go on a long journey at one point, and the shadow comes to him and says, I'll make a bargain with you. I'll give you what you want as long as you come and pretend to be my shadow, because shadows don't have shadows, and he needs one in order to do this. It's a really wonderful story.
Wow. Yeah, it rings a bell. That rings a bell, that one. I have something in my memory remembers that. But yeah, isn't it interesting? Like both Anderson and the Grimms and Cavallo had massive collections, but we only know these, small number of fairy tales. And I noticed in your, so you're co-founder of Orange and Bee, which is on Substack. I noticed you've been getting a lot of Red Riding Hood submissions and things like that. Yeah, and it's nice to get some of these more unusual fairy tales in. And I think that's part of why I'm doing this. I want people to know that there's more beyond Red Riding Hood, Cinderella, Sleeping Beauty, Snow White. There is much more out there, and they're beautiful, like the Sugar Doll. Absolutely stunning sort of fairy tales that people can be drawn to. And that actually reminded me a bit of the Toy Princess, how she's swapped out for a toy. And I feel like there's another story along that same vein that I've read or heard of there, where the woman is swapped out. It might be another Cavallo one. I think he put it one with a maid.
There's one with a maid. There's also in Falada, the handkerchief one. There's, she's not quite a false bride, but when the servant girl replaces the princess, and the servant girl goes and joins the court, and the princess is forced to work as a goose girl, which is where the story title usually comes from. They call her the goose girl, and cuts off the horse's head and nails it to the gate, and the true princess, the true bride, has to go and work in the field with the geese. While her servant girl, I think she does actually marry the prince. Depends which version you read. So many different versions. She either actually marries the prince or participates in the court as if she's going to. But, lots of bridal substitutions. Which is very weird. Lots where the veil covers some, ogre or doppelganger, some kind of. Yeah, they're interesting.
Goose Girl is
many ways to
really
get out
one.
of getting married.
Yeah. Well, this is true. I think the Goose Girl is one of those that really should have more attention than it does. It's such a great story. Yeah,
it's a wonderful story. I love the horse's head nailed to the gate that talks to her as she passes through. Such a wonderful image. Really quite a strange image. And I do love stories that have non-human non-humans in them. There's so many stories where humans and non-humans transform into each other. And I think there's something, so fascinating about our, across many cultures, this fascination with the idea that we might become animals, or animals might become us, that we might become each other for a period of time, and as a punishment or a reward or a curse, or it's very different each time.
We see that
So quite
in traditional dance as well, like across the world, traditional dance embodying animals, makeup, I mean the headpieces and like the antlers in Europe, the antlers were very important part of that transformation sort of stories. I wonder what that's got in for us, though, the transformation stories. What's your take on those?
Oh, I don't think you can nail it down to one thing. I think we could have a whole podcast series about what that might mean. I think it means different things. I think sometimes it's a punishment. One of the things I've been thinking about lately is that often it's a punishment. So a person is punished by being transformed into a non-human, and usually an animal. And often they can't speak and they're cast out of the home. And I think then it really stands in for this thing that to participate in human culture, you have to be able to speak and negotiate and do all these other kind of civilized things that the Saloniers you were referring to before thought were really important. Have good conversation and use the right fork and dress well and participate in court and stuff. But people who are transformed into animals can't do those things. They can't participate in the culture. They can't do that stuff. So they're kind of cut out from it. So it's often a punishment, which is really, I think it's interesting, even though it reinforces this idea that humans and animals are in a hierarchical relationship and humans are at the top. I don't think that's true. So it's often that sense that you're going down a peg to become a deer or a bear or all these kinds of things. And then, you don't read them as much, but stories where animals become humans are much less common, but more often seem to be veiled conversations about people climbing up the class ladder when they shouldn't, becoming, pigs who become humans and go to court, or sheep or something. And then, there's really the sense that you should go back to being what you're supposed to be. So often they're about staying in your lane. Those kind of stories.
Yeah,
but in other traditions, I think, I think in other traditions there's more of an interest in that we are animals, and that sometimes those stories probably more for contemporary writers than those very traditional writers. Often in contemporary retellings, reworkings, there's something going on there often about connecting more with our own animal nature and connecting with the natural world and having these experiences that force us to put down the pretenses of culture and civilization and become more embodied creatures. What do you think?
Well, I was just reminded of like the great chain of being, like that philosophy that underpinned where God is at the top, then the angels, archangels and angels, and how much damage that's caused to our connection to the animate world. That particular philosophy underpins religion, underpins politics, it underpins so much. And I guess when we talk about it within the fairy tales, it's permission to challenge something that's deeply ingrained in our culture, that we don't even question it. The hierarchy of beings, with humans apparently at the top of it, so men actually apparently at the top of it, a particular type of man at the top, like you could get right down to this the hierarchy, which is that, I've tended to stay away from animal tales, but that's more fables. I've tended to stay more away from fables in my storytelling than, say, the wolf in The Giant with No Heart in His Body. I love that character, the wolf and the horse and the you know,
Yeah.
and even Red Riding Hood's wolf, you know, there's something wonderful about that character that brings something, you know, it reflects the female experience of being hunted and being deceived and, you know, yeah. So there was lots that
You know,
popped
and
into
I
my
think,
head
you
as you
know,
were
Red Riding
talking.
Hood's
Yeah.
Red Riding Hood's so interesting because the wolf is, of course, in the woods, and Red Riding's that classic tale that goes structurally, you know, from the village to the woods and then back to the village at the end. And so in the middle, you get the woods, and the woods is where, you know, this Freudian id gets loose, and there's this sense that the uncivilized, desiring body and that cannibalistic aspect of the wolf comes into play. You know, that those things all happen in the woods. I mean, the wolf is so interesting because he is, you know, Perrault makes him a kind of rapist or a sexually harassing creature. But of course, there's that idea that, well, is it an idea? There are some other versions of that story in which the wolf is a werewolf, a bourgeois in the French tradition, and that in entering the woods, Red has to choose between two paths, the path of needles and the path of pins. And so there's quite a different thing about coming of age as this rite of passage in which she has to make choices and encounter what would he say? Challenges that she has to make decisions about in order to determine her path in life. Anyway, that's a bit of a scramble, but I think the wolf is kind of interesting.
Yeah, but that is the nature of fairy tale discussion, though. It is a scramble. We can look at it from a ecological lens. We can look at it through a feminist lens. We can look at it through a Indigenous lens. We can look at, you know, like there's a whole range of perspectives that we can bring to fairy tale, and that's what makes it really interesting because all of us come at it with a different, like, you know, at the moment I'm in the literary lens mode, you know, like, so we all come from it in different places. And so I just wanted to have a chat with you about your work with fairy tales, historically, what you've done with fairy tales and your academic career and what you've been doing and where you've been going and where you're going now.
Oh, well, I've been around through the woods, into the woods and out again. Well, I think first of all, I really just consider myself a big fan of fairy tales and a reader of them and of both traditional tales and contemporary work that draws on them. And I'm really excited about what's going on in that space. I've read some wonderful work in the last few years that's engaging in that space. And, you know, I'm also interested in writing in that space as a writer. So I do, I've mostly been doing short stories. I've got this novel that I finished the edits on this week. So that's also working in that space. So, well, you know, a reader, and you know, like most readers, you sometimes write, you kind of get drawn into that space. And as an academic, I've done quite a bit of research around fairy tales, including like their traditional history and contemporary retellings and looking at those sort of things. And I've taught fairy tales scholarship for a long time. Oh, I hesitate even to say how long, a few decades now. But I left academia last year, in the middle of last year, finally, and I'm very glad I did. So now, you know, and before I left, Karina and I founded the Orange and Bee, and so now, you know, a big part of the work I'm doing in that space is around nurturing other people's who are writing in that space and building some community around that. And which is it's really fun. It's a lot of fun reading. Like we've got an open submissions window at the moment, and so we're in the process of reading lots and lots of submissions. And it's really interesting to read the sorts of things that come over the transom into the inbox. Yeah, so mostly that's what I'm kind of doing. And then, as I said, I finished this book, so I'm hoping that that will um, come out in the next couple of years. Oh, God, it takes so long, publishing so slow moving, but we'll see.
Is it fiction
Just
or
writing,
non-fiction?
just fiction, very
Yeah.
much so. Yeah, yeah. So that'll
Well,
be good. We'll
congratulations.
see.
That's very exciting. Yeah.
It is, although I said to my wife when I finished it, which is, just yesterday or the day before or something, I said, I finished it, I finished the edits. And she said, again? It's like, what do you mean again? I think sometimes a novel in particular, maybe short stories and poems too can be like that. Like you think you've finished this version of it, and then you send it off and someone else reads it, and then you do the edits, and then someone else reads it, and then you do the edits. But this time I was doing edits that my agent had suggested, and I'd sat on them for longer than I should have for a whole range of reasons. So they felt big to me, like really sort of, mm, it felt big to get it done.
Yeah.
So I'm glad they're done. Off it
No,
goes.
well done. Well done you.
Bless
That's
it.
not an easy thing, not an easy thing to do. Yeah.
No. Although
Yeah.
I'd rather be editing than writing the first draft.
Oh no, I love the drafting process. I hate the editing. I find editing
Oh,
really
no.
overwhelming. I can edit other people's work,
No.
but not my own. I find my own really hard to be objective about. Yeah.
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 Yeah, that can be very hard. It can be very hard. I think I just find, writing the first draft or the first couple of drafts actually is so slow, like so slow. But I'm a very slow writer. And, you have to make a million decisions, it feels like. Every paragraph is, 50 decisions that you have to make.
Yeah.
And not, and those decisions are so open-ended. You could go anywhere, like anywhere almost. And the closer you get to the end of the book, the more those start to narrow down. But at the beginning, it's anything. What kind of book do you want to write? I don't know. Just make it about, this. But yeah, so there's that kind of that that huge openness is both really exciting to me, but also means that it just takes a long time to make all those
Mm.
decisions. And editing is much tighter. You're like,
Yeah.
well, we're going to have to fix this, and we can fix it, one of three ways.
Yeah.
So that's kind of easier. I
Yeah.
find that much easier. And you've
Yeah.
got something you're trying to fix. So at least you can wrangle it,
Yeah.
And if worst comes to worst, you can just burn it.
Oh no, kill your darlings. No. So you've got your
Oh,
book
yeah.
and you've
Yeah.
got the Orange and
Mm.
Bee stuff. Is there anything else you're working
Yep.
on or future plans?
Oh, I've been doing a bit of I've been doing some printmaking. So very
Oh yes, they're lovely. If anyone
um
hasn't seen them, they're lovely. The bird ones.
cute.
They're mostly birds, are they?
Yeah,
Yeah.
mostly birds. Yeah, I did
Yeah.
a whole month of birds just because I live in a really beautiful part of the country, on Bundjalung country, um and near the sea. I can hear the sea from my home, and we walk on the beach pretty much every day, and see lots of seabirds and other wildlife. So I decided that I would, just make one bird a day, these very small prints. And so I was doing that for a while, but I'm sort of thinking about doing some work that brings the fairy tale stuff, my fairy tale interest into that printmaking. So that's something I'm just toying with at this stage. I don't really know what will happen there. I don't know. Every now and then I think, oh, I could do some illustrations the for Orange and Bee for the stories that we publish. And I'm like, no, don't mix eggs and vinegar.
Well, I
But
mean,
we'll see. So
really,
lots of things got going.
that's quite good though, like because I think when we think about the fairy tales, our images of the characters are grounded in the illustrator's
Mm,
interpretations of them. I remember seeing
mm.
an image of Gollum that was done in Sweden, and Gollum was like a giant
Oh,
thing that I don't know, big eyes and a slimy face. And that would have changed the whole story if you were reading it, if you've got this image in your mind. So with the fairy tales, it's the same with Cinderella, blonde hair, blue dress. I don't think it says that in the Perot version. I don't think it tells us what color the dress is. So, that interpretation of the art is really, it sets the foundation for the story and our image of what we imagine it to be. So I say more art, the better, more interpretation of fairy tale art, for sure.
Yeah. Well, it's fun. And it's good to get you away from the computer. I spend, as a writer and an editor and, an academic, recovering academic, I've spent so much of my life sitting at a desk in front of a computer that I'm very grateful for anything that gets me away back into the garden, out into the studio and making a mess, getting my hands dirty.
Yeah.
It's nice to do something that's just a completely different process. It's good. Yeah.
And so my final question to you is, where do you see fairy tales moving forward? Where are they? How do they fit in the modern world?
It's an interesting question. I think the interesting thing about fairy tales is that, like all folklore, they're in a constant state of revision. They're never settled, and they never stay still, and they're constantly evolving. Both the stories that we already have, and as a body of lore and as a sort of body of stories, they're constantly moving, evolving, shifting machine. So it's both hard to say what they are. One of the things when you're teaching fairy tales is it's really difficult to actually say what they are. Or you can say what they have been historically or what they are to particular people. So it's hard to say what they are. I think going forward, like they always seem to be these stories, maybe like all stories, that reflect the cultural moment that they're created in and the people who are working with them. Certainly, my observation in the English-speaking world is that most of the people, definitely not all of the people, but most of the people working with fairy tales are women and non-binary people, and that it lends the current sort of body of fairy tale work that's being written a particular kind of emphasis. So there's lots of stories that are coming from that perspective, but they're becoming more political. People are more, lots of people are interested in writing fairy tales that are set or take place in something more approximating the contemporary real world than that sort of once upon a time that historically we associate with fairy tales as kind of generic Europe, generic sort of Middle Europe, Germany, France, sort of thing. So that's one of the things, I think that they'll always be with us because I think that they have a weight, like any stories that we carry around for centuries in our culture. They have this sort of crusted on complexity that's really interesting to storytellers and art makers. They already have a whole bunch of symbolic meanings, but they aren't so, at the same time, they're still fluid. They're still able to be reimagined and reconfigured to mean something else. And often we're still writing about, how to reconfigure them, how to make those images fresh, how to make them re-signify, which is such an academic way of putting it. Oh dear.
I guess my hope is that when people do reconfigure them, they don't lose the essence, because the story is like a living being, I think, and there's some essence of it still there. And if you change Cinderella to Cinderfella, that's great, but don't lose the essence of the story, like the essence of the, I don't know, there's something really heartfelt within the foundation of the story that I feel.
Yeah, that's interesting. I guess I do feel that because I certainly read some stories. I'm like, oh no, that's not a very good, like that's going too far or it's taking the wrong direction. But then I think, oh, what's wrong with that? Because I think because they're such a democratic roiling ball of stories that belongs to everyone, they don't belong to one culture or one cultural group of people. As a body of work, they're robust enough to take almost anything. And that's kind of what makes them interesting and fluid, is that someone will take it in some weird direction and be a real outlier, but that will just become part of the great rumbling, war
Yes.
machine that is fairy tales. It just chews up everything and takes it in and, redigests it and becomes this huge body of work. So I don't know. I don't feel that protective of it really as a body of stories. I just love them, and I think they're robust enough to do that, to sort of accommodate a whole bunch of different people's interpretations and reworkings. And I think that's actually what makes them interesting. I love communist fairy tales. I love those fairy tales I wrote during I think I've written about them before on the Orange and Bee, but during the First World War, there were whole collections of fairy tales that were about the pro-war effort. Like, I just think they're so strange. And there were some early Australian ones that were all about colonization. And I've got one collection that's all sort of 30s and 40s that's about the Depression and about immigration, and and fairy tales, they haven't, there were these movements, and it just becomes part of that. Does that make sense? This big roiling
Yes.
ball of stories. Yeah, I think that's what's so great about them. They'll just keep going. They'll just roll on and become
people
something
know
else.
them. Yeah, people know them.
Yeah.
Yeah. Having said that, I told a story at school the other day, and the kids didn't know Three Billy Goats Gruff, and they didn't know. There's another one I told that they didn't know either. And I went, oh, this is really sad. We really need to tell our
Well, now they know them, though.
Well, they do. They know the ones I told them, but well, we have to finish up now. So where can people find you if they want to know more about the work that you do with fairy tale?
Mostly the Orange and Bee is the best way to find me, which is on Substack. And I also have a Substack of my own called Bird and Bone, which is where I post other things, musings about writing and art and God knows what. But that's kind of it. I don't really do a lot of social media. I do have a Facebook page, but I don't really keep it awake. It's dying.
I got kicked off it, so I'm okay.
The Orange and Bee.
Yeah, awesome.
Oh, you got kicked off.
I got kicked off.
Right.
I obviously offended. I offended the Facebook gods.
Oh, well, they're not human, so it doesn't matter. You can't offend.
Well, thank you so much for your time today, Nikki. It's been a pleasure.
Thanks, Alyssa. It's been a pleasure to talk to you this afternoon.
Well, that was a treat. I hope you enjoy the interview with Nikki. Stay tuned next month for another wonderful human being working with fairy tale. Until then, go well.